Now that we have stressed the importance of safe and regular pathways and the importance that complementary labour pathways play, we're going to start panel 1. And let's start our 2-day journey where we all welcome you on this ride, as I try not to butcher any of the speakers' names as we're coming up in the following sessions. Now, our very first panel of the day is a reflection on the past 3 years in the framework of the DT4E and putting complementary labour pathways to Europe into practice. As Anita was saying, this is a critically important programme, and this panel will focus on the DT4E outcomes and how complementary labour pathways have facilitated integration and employment for displaced individuals in Europe. And in this subsequent panel, we'll look at the challenges and opportunities linked to legal barriers, mobility, integration, and employer engagement. The panelists, and we have some excellent panelists in this next session, from the various participating countries, will provide and distill some important lessons learned and recommendations for the way ahead.
So please join me in welcoming Rob De Lobel, Head of Unit for Labour Mobility and Social Inclusion at IOM Belgium and Luxembourg. Gemma Hyslop, Senior Manager at Fragomen. Christopher Millward, Complementary Pathways Senior Policy Advisor at UK Home Office. Katrien Degrauwe, Head of Unit for Legal Pathways at Fedasil. And our very own Khaled Akar, Network Field Technician and TBB alumnus. Our first panel of speakers will be moderated by the visionary Marina Brizar, UK and Europe Director at TBB. Marina was born in Bosnia, and due to the Balkan Civil War, she migrated to Australia as a refugee with her family in 1995. She's an Australian qualified immigration lawyer and has been recognised by the Law Council of Australia with multiple awards, including the Young Migration Lawyer of the Year. One of my favourite facts about Marina is that in 2018, she featured in the SBS documentary, Go Back to Where You Came From. She was partnered with Senator Jackie Lambie and spent time in Syria, and it is definitely worth looking up on YouTube. I recommend it. In 2019, she completed a Churchill Fellowship where she conceived of displaced talent mobility, and in 2020 led the formation of TBB in UK, Europe and beyond. She's based in London. Please welcome her on stage.
This is awkward. Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, friends. I'm going to take Anita's tone and say hello, friends. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'm just going to take a moment to say thank you to my colleague Paulina, as well as Luca, for that incredible video. And the animations that you saw were actually by Karim, who was featured in that video. So yeah, that was a really nice way to start this. Also acknowledging that there are a lot of Australians you've heard from this morning, which is maybe strange in a European context. Also, lots of green and red in the audience today. So it's the colour of the season. Notice that in your breaks. So to start this panel, I wanted to, well, keep it about myself for 1 second, but really just to say that I have a refugee story, but mine wasn't displaced talent mobility, unfortunately. My parents were skilled, but we survived a war and moved to Australia. Within 6 months, my dad got a job as an engineer and my mum as an accountant. And that's where my journey of displaced talent mobility started, this idea of we wouldn't have had to endure that if my parents could find a job and move safely. And on a very rainy, dark day in London, in the depths of the pandemic in 2020, I got a call from Bindu Isaac from IOM. Bindu, where you at? Bindu. Saying we'd met a few times before, and she was like, we have this AMIF idea, maybe we do labour mobility in the UK and Europe, given the success in Australia and Canada with TBB, what do you reckon? I thought it was so far-fetched and so unreal to conceive of bringing that to a place in a world that was completely still in the pandemic. But here we are with almost 500 people celebrating this. So I just want to take a moment to congratulate and thank all of you for being here and for showing interest. So round of applause for yourselves, please. Thank you. So thank you very much to a very esteemed panel. We've prepared a list of questions, but not in order. So this is roulette. You might see a little bit of scrambling. We're going to keep it quite dynamic, which is what we hope this conference will be. But given the context of sort of how DT4E started and sort of how far we've come in terms of numbers, I wanted to start and open with a question to you, Rob. And that question is, can you reflect on some of the outcomes, on some of the successes and the key takeaways in terms of the positive outcomes of DT4E that have sort of transpired over the last 3 years?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Marina, and nice to see a room filled of people and interest here as well. So welcome everybody from my side. Yes, as I'm based in Belgium, the IOM office, country office for Belgium. So the things that I'm going to say are going to relate more, I think, to countries of destinations within these complementary pathways. But there are a number of things, I think, over the last years that are worth mentioning in terms of impact and positive outcomes. I think the main thing that I want to start with is that I think we've established the pathways and we've understood how they should operationally be set up for them to be successful. Typically, these pathways are made of several steps, right? It goes from all the way, back in the source countries, identifying the talents, matching them, with vacancies and so on and so on. Then we have the preparation phase for the talents. We get them to move to their country of destination, and then we start onboarding them, integrating them, and so on and so on. So we've really, we broke up these pathways into these different steps. And I think one of the key things that we've succeeded in doing in the last years, and I'm now particularly talking for the EU member states also that were part of DT4E and that were relatively new to these complementary pathways, is that we've been able to mainstream, I think, these pathways into the existing structures, frameworks, into the member states, right? So where we began like 3-4 years ago, a lot of these steps, we would have had the tendency to do them ourselves, right? We would have selected those talents ourselves or pre-selected them. We would have put them on a plane ourselves. We would have welcomed them ourselves and so forth. I think today what you see is that a lot of stakeholders have come on board in our pathway, right? And that makes a huge difference. We're talking about public stakeholders, but we're also talking about private stakeholders, obviously. And in each of the steps, you have a lot of stakeholders that have joined us. And I think that that is a very positive development. It means that it's not only on the operational team that has been introduced here today, that the pressure is to get these things running. It means that we have the support and the help of these different public and private stakeholders. They carry a bit of the weight also operationally on their own shoulders. So I think that's really a big impact. I'm happy to give some examples of what I mean with this. I think in the beginning, for instance, we were doing kind of reach out to potential employers ourselves. If you look at the situation today, the outreach is done a little bit in a structural, standardized way by public employment services, by private HR businesses that are actually presenting complementary pathways, DT4E, to their clients as one of the options to hire talent, right? It's not the only option, of course. There's a whole series of options, a whole series of talent pools. But it's interesting to see that these entities have become ambassadors of DT4E and the complementary pathways. And that's just one example. I think there's plenty of others that I could mention, but I'll stop here for a moment and maybe we can come back to it at a later stage.
Absolutely. So I think that core outcome is this idea of designing for sustainability and designing for scale, so that when a project ends, the movement doesn't end. And I think that's a really powerful outcome. And as you say, it's really nice to hear other people saying, I heard about this from someone we've never even heard from. And it's this idea of building an ecosystem, which is a really strong outcome. no doubt, as you, Rob, walk through the process, there's the matching, there's the preparation, there's the mobility and the integration. I think you led with, we've opened the pathways. And I think from a legal perspective, that has been a real challenge. So Gemma, I'm looking at you. Can you talk a little bit about the most common barriers that displaced individuals face in terms of accessing employment through the existing labour migration pathways?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marina, and hi, everyone. Lovely to be here with you today. Indeed, the concept of refugee labour mobility is still relatively new. It's something that we're building out, but typically what we have when people move is either a system of managed migration where somebody moves through that towards a work permit, or, as Anita alluded, we have an asylum process of resettlement or similar. In most countries, if not all, those two systems are designed in silos, so they stand very much apart from one another. And what we're trying to do with refugee labour mobility is find an overlap between those two. It's sort of a Venn diagram, if you imagine that overlap in the middle. But that can be remarkably difficult, because those systems are designed separately. So to try to bring them together is a little bit like oil on water, and it's presented its difficulties. But that's where it's really, it behoves us to think creatively about that, about how best it can work. I use the UK as an example, being my main area of focus. So we have particular pathways into the UK through sponsored work permits. And when we thought about this from the very beginning, we had some wild ideas of how it might work, but in reality the pathway, it works effectively for people who are applying from their home countries. So to adapt it for refugee labour mobility as part of the Displaced Talent pipeline, we just had to make a few tweaks, really, just to remove the administrative barriers that disproportionately impact people simply because they are displaced. It was never a question of looking to lower the eligibility criteria. That simply is not necessary because the candidates are immensely skilled and they meet the requirements anyway. It's just removing those bureaucratic barriers that disproportionately impact them simply because they are displaced. But we also had to be mindful of making sure we were building in protection elements. Again, that's a sort of an unusual element within a system of managed migration, just to make sure that in the unlikely event that somebody fell out of work, there were protection mechanisms in place against refoulement, etc. With the Home Office, we're brilliant partners in that respect and just worked with us in a very pragmatic manner to sort of make those small adjustments that were required to facilitate the Displaced Talent for Europe programme in the UK, and that has worked to great success. So I think another element to focus on in terms of the legal barriers can be the lack of formal residence in the host country. So when you make a visa application to move to another country, typically you are expected to have legal status in the country from which you apply. Where people are displaced, unfortunately, that's sometimes not the case. And that lack of status also means, as Anita alluded earlier, that people are working without full rights and recognition, meaning that their employment history may not be recognized, etc. So when it comes to applying for a work permit in a system that looks back at your work history, that can further complicate things. That's something about which we had to think holistically and creatively, but we found solutions. So there definitely are barriers, but we have learned so many lessons as part of DT4E that will inform us moving forward as part of best practice as we continue to scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemma. This is turning out to be a little bit less roulette-y than I thought, because you very conveniently alluded to our strong partnership with the Home Office in the UK. I will say we were very lucky. Well, we had some great success in the UK with establishing a pilot in 2020. And because of some grandfathering provisions post-Brexit, the UK was a partner of this project. And that was a real advantage because there were some lessons learned already that we can incorporate into DT4E. Now, the UK program has achieved a few milestones this week alone. So the first is that our first test case, our first pioneer, when we were like, can a refugee get a skilled worker visa in the UK? This week secured indefinite leave to remain, so permanent residence, meaning that he has been in the UK working for 5 years and is now a permanent resident on the way to citizenship of the United Kingdom. And the second milestone is that our first cohort of nurses who arrived to the UK this week celebrated their 3-year anniversary in the UK. One of those people is our colleague and the person who pretty much put this event together. Her name is Jana. She's online. Hi, Jana. Thank you very much. But really strong milestones from the UK, and it really lends to a strong partnership that I will say now for the third time. But Chris, if I could please put to you just a question around how the UK government's immigration policy has evolved to support displaced individuals entering the labour market using the skilled worker visa.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for everyone for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So yes, our track record on this, and bear in mind, I'm giving a lot of this information to you secondhand in the sense that I've not been in the team that long, but it's, you know, it's a real pleasure to get involved in this and hear about some of the interesting things that are happening. I'm very interested to hear some of those lessons from you as well. But the history of this is that, you know, back in 2001, as part of a debate in our upper legislative chamber, the House of Lords, a bishop, the Bishop of Durham, made an intervention and asked, well, what about, you know, barriers to refugees and displaced people accessing the skilled worker visa? And yes, in the UK, bishops can, if they choose, play a role in the legislative process. And yeah, and we decided that was something we definitely wanted to act on. So in October 2001, we launched a pilot with our partners, delivery partner TBB, and a lot of the sort of core policy of it is still extant, as alluded to. 5 years leave. You can apply for indefinite leave to remain afterwards. You are entitled to bring a spouse and dependent children. And yeah, the original idea was for up to 200 visas to be issued under the pilot. What changed? Well, our initial focus was on Lebanon and Jordan, and that's mainly based on the footprint Talent Beyond Boundaries had there. That is now extended to, it's now a worldwide scheme, and we get candidates coming from a number of countries, including places like Sudan, Iran, and other places. And the final thing is that the original intent of the scheme was to focus on degree level shortage occupations. Now that changed at some point, and it is now any occupation where we deem to have a shortage, and where we think there are gaps in the skills market. And I think, you know, just in my mind, one of the things I'd encourage as we sort of develop our policy in this area is just to bear in mind, you know, and I often remind my own colleagues of this, is that low skilled does not necessarily equal low demand. There are sectors where, you know, that you have sectors which are screaming out for talent, which is not necessarily degree level. So yeah, I would definitely encourage, as we develop our policy, to think in those terms. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, that was exactly how it happened. The Bishop of Durham, the Minister for Immigration, said we're building a skilled migration system post-Brexit for the best and brightest, no matter where they come from. And the Bishop of Durham said even refugees, and the Minister was like, I guess so. And that's how the pilot started. One of the incredible features of the UK pilot is that we have what's called a dedicated desk, so a dedicated team and contact that we approach once we have a visa lodge, and the visa turns around in usually 24 hours. So it is a remarkable turnaround, sometimes a little too quick, as we scramble with our colleagues at IOM to make sure that there's great integration support provided. But yeah, it is a super effective program with not a lot of change, just some administrative adaptations. I am now going to pass to you, Khaled. So Khaled is one of our candidates who has moved to Dublin, one of our first candidates into the EU through DT4E. And I'd just like to firstly thank you and acknowledge that you are here, and ask if you could share a little bit about your personal journey of being a beneficiary and an alumni of DT4E.
Hi, everyone. So I would like to thank everyone for coming. And I would like to thank TBB and IOM for letting me to participate in this panel. I never thought it will happen. Like I thought I will be clapping only. Yeah. So my name is Khaled Akar. I'm Palestinian refugee from Lebanon. Now I'm a network field technician in Ireland. It all started when I was a part-time job, a bellboy in a telecommunication company in Lebanon. So basically, I was trying to cover my university fees. And over the years, I was graduated. I have like 2 bachelor degrees, but unfortunately, like I didn't secure a good job in Lebanon. So I was promoted at the same company. Like last title, it was fiber optic splicer, network field technician. And it was my only way to secure a job outside Lebanon. In 2022, I heard about talent boundaries. And actually, I heard it from a friend who applied, created a profile, but for the moment, he didn't get the chance to match a job. So I created a profile and I was like, I'm not sure if I'd make it or not, or trust TBB or IOM. But like after 1 year, I received a message. I was like stunned. It's like, now I have hope. So yeah, I'll work on myself to prepare for the interview. Actually, IOM and TBB, they started preparing me well for the interview. I did like a lot of meetings. After securing the job, also they went through the details of the job offer to help me like better understand where I'm going to Ireland. They supported me with all the process of the visa, the documents that I really like. Without TBB and IOM, I would never overcome, because it's very hard to know like which visa, which link to go through, and what documents should I prepare. And when I went to Ireland, relocated to Ireland, it was very like welcoming. I'm very happy to be in Ireland. Of course, it's sad like to leave everything behind for 32 years. Like I was in Lebanon, and suddenly like literally in 4 hours you just travel from one and like suddenly you're alone. But you know, like I really feel that TBB and IOM are my only family here in Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Khaled. So I think you've covered the main part. So you were identified, you were matched, you found the job, you got the visa. I really want to pick up on that last point that you made around sort of feeling alone. We saw you in the video arrive with a colleague. And I hear that we had a check-in with you with our colleague Tegwin just to see how things were going, which was rescheduled because you were going to a football game, I think. So that's a good integration outcome. But can you just talk a little bit about, you know, you have the physical elements of actually moving to another country, but can you share a little bit about your sense of belonging and integration into the local community and what that's been like? Because you haven't been in Ireland for long. So can you talk a little bit about being part of the society, as Anita said?
Yeah, of course. It was very hard for me and for my colleague. Like literally the first week, I was crying. Oh, no, Khaled, don't go back to Lebanon. You have to integrate well with the community, with the society, to figure out like this is the new life. So it's I took the step. I have to take all the consequences. And I thought it's gonna take like a while to integrate well in the country, but honestly, like I found myself after 2 weeks going to the Rathcool Football Club. It was like 5 minutes away from my home. I asked for the manager WhatsApp like number, and then I texted them. I told him that I'm Palestinian refugee. I came on a work permit. I'm working. I live here, and I want to like come and train with the lads. Now I learned this word also. So he was like, "Yeah, you're totally welcome." And like the first training, even my friends at the Rathcool Football Club, they were so happy because I'm like a Palestinian refugee. I'm working, and we share like common interest, which is basically the football. So also as well, like I was welcomed by the neighbors with the work environment at work. My colleague and my supervisor, even my manager, like we were a team. Going on site every day with my colleague. He's Irish, so I'm learning very well, integrating very well. like even on Saturday and Sunday, going to watch a game, Premier League and everything. Learning the slang and street language in Ireland, I thought it could be like, it is very difficult because the first months it was like, if two Irish people are speaking, oh no, if I don't know the subject, nothing like. But when I know if they work about work, yeah, I understand. But if he's speaking with his friend, no, I can't understand anything. So basically now I'm learning a lot, and I was telling one of the attendants here that last word it was like acting of bollocks. So we were working, and they was like, we're acting of bollocks. Acting of what? So I had to Google everything, but it's very good because I'm learning the best way. And this is part of my personality that I Google everything. I go and watch videos. And one more thing, how I'm getting along and to integrate into the country is to listening to podcasts, because my supervisor, he told me that this is one way to learn the language and to learn about the Irish culture. So one of the last podcasts, it's about a tree, and seriously, like imagine a story of tree is telling you the culture of Ireland and UK and the history and everything. So I'm trying to find any way to integrate into this society.
Great, thank you so much. Sounds like you're doing really well, integrating very quickly. This is going to naturally take us to you, Katrien. So Fedasil is our integration partner for DT4E. In Belgium. And so you play a role in helping shape integration for people that arrive in Belgium. You do this typically for people with a humanitarian background, but can you talk a little bit about Fedasil's adaptations for reception and integration for people who arrive through displaced talent mobility and what that integration journey looks like?
First of all, I had 1 year of studies in Ireland, so I really understand the language issues that you might have when you
Wait, I think we need this one.
Yeah. But indeed, Fedasil is the Belgian reception agency. So traditionally, we really focus on receiving and hosting refugees in Belgium. But a few years ago, we decided to have a bigger focus on future orientation, to inform, guide, accompany refugees towards a future in Belgium or in other countries, in third countries. And under this department, we have a legal migration unit, which traditionally focused on resettlement, but well, in line with the EU evolutions and recommendations, we also more and more worked on legal pathways, complementary pathways. In this project, DT4E, our role is really organizing pre-departure orientation and post-arrival orientation. So really to prepare refugees that are selected in the project, to prepare them to a life in Belgium. We organize a 3 days training when they're still there, so 2 to 4 weeks before arrival. And it's really on what does Belgium look like, very general, but also how do you look for housing, how is the employment market working, how is the education system, healthcare system, everything, to really prepare them as best as possible, and also to manage their expectations, because that's sometimes an issue. And then when they arrive here, we organize a post-arrival orientation. A few weeks or months after they arrived, we go back to them for a 1 day orientation day, training day, to see which questions are still left and to help them guide through their life in Belgium. We see that there is not a lot of, there was no big need of major adaptations with how we do it for resettled refugees. Of course, the focus is a bit bigger on employment and also on the work culture in Belgium. And we also see that we get quite a lot of questions on what with the partner, how, because this legal pathway is really focusing on one talent that applies for a job, but often they have a family, and we get questions about, okay, can they integrate in life in Belgium? Can they study? Can they work? Do they have a work permit, etc.? So that's another focus that we have. Yeah, thanks. Take that.
So yeah, thank you very much. And I think that brings us to the next sort of point around some of our lessons. And one of those is I guess the challenges of integrating family members. So with displaced talent mobility, typically the most empowered person is the one that's lifted out of the household to then build a community at work and to have purpose and go to work. So what happens to the family? That's just one of the challenges that we've identified and are working on. But I wanted to just share some numbers and some stats. So the first is that as a DT4E project team, we've pitched to over 220 employers over 3 years. We've secured 129 job offers. 225 people have found a solution. 30% of primary candidates are female, and 98% of people are still working in their job. So two people have left their work. I mean, they're quite astounding figures. And when you think about that against the backdrop of two wars, the Taliban takeover, record inflation resulting in hiring freezes, and really consequential elections and campaigns and uncertainty in political environments, it's, for me, even more remarkable. And Rob, I'm going to pass to you again, please. Just if you can identify the top 3 challenges for the project team, and sort of how we've been able to navigate that. If you could reflect on that, please.
Sure, yes. I limit it to 3 because there's quite some challenges, of course. And so it might sound all very very easy, but in practice, of course, you know, it's often a little bit complicated. So it's difficult to pick out 3. I think there's a number of them that are probably valid across the board. Maybe I'll start with a very operational one. It might sound like, you know, a small thing, but in the end, it is a big thing. And I think it's a big thing in a lot of countries. It's the integration element, but in particular within the integration, the housing question, right? So you typically have indeed people that have been hired, employers that are enthusiastic, but the key question is, where are these people going to sleep once they arrive here in Europe, right? And there's no magic solutions to that, unfortunately. So we're really facing that issue as a huge obstacle. In Belgium, the rental market is a bit overheated for everyone, basically. It's very difficult to find a space. And if you find one, it's very expensive. So imagine you come from a faraway country. Imagine you've been displaced. You don't have references. You don't know the system here, and so on and so on. It just makes it so much more difficult. So that is really a challenge, I think, that we've encountered. We're looking into, you know, what could be possible solutions for this. There are existing loan programs in IOM that we're investigating, and how to apply these potentially to complementary pathways, which would mean, for instance, that the displaced person would access a loan to be able, for instance, to pay the guarantee that is often required when you want to rent something structurally. You can agree on how those modalities would work. Would the employer play a role in that? Would the employer actually, in some cases, be the one granting the loan? Would it be the government? Would it be another entity? All questions we're looking into. I think there is an idea of indeed maybe having a more structural fund, a guarantee fund or something like that, that also reassures the owners that are renting their place. And sometimes you could say, like, why don't we work with intermediaries, like agencies that are specialized in the market, and that can maybe on behalf of our talents reassure the owners and take maybe some of the risks. But of course, if you go that way, and if these agencies are private agencies, that also comes at a cost, which then brings us back to which of these displaced talents arriving can pay all of those costs, you know, on day one after their arrival, right? Because it's often on day one that the problem is really the biggest. Once you're, you know, here for 3, 4, 6 months, then, you know, these things smoothen out. But it's really the first few months, I think, that are really critical. Obviously, we talk a lot to the employers themselves. Some of them are very open to this, are absolutely willing to help. But for others, it's very new and also very, very, very complicated. So the housing issue is one of them. I think for countries in the European Union, and then in particular countries like Belgium, less, I think, Ireland, because you have, of course, the English language, but countries like Slovakia that are not going to join and so forth. There's the language issue. That is something that is very important. A lot of the employers here in Belgium, they say, well, do they speak Dutch or do they speak French, right? And often for French, we find maybe sometimes some talents, but for Dutch, it's mission impossible. So we need to find a way also to close that gap, right? And I think on that one, we've explored and tried some things. And at this stage, we have indeed a model where you can indeed, even pre-departure, get displaced talents into a room and start learning the language of their destination country, right? So the idea is that they pick up on a basic course pre-departure. So when the moment they arrive here, they have a basic knowledge of the language and they continue the language course once they've arrived. I think it's indeed, especially also in regulated sectors, think about nursing, where language is so critical. It's indeed very good that we have now, together with our partners and stakeholders in Belgium, it's also the government that has opened up to this idea of providing language courses pre-departure. In the past, it used to be only for people that were here, newcomers that are on the territory. Today, there's this opening towards, yes, why not start pre-departure? These people have a contract. These people are going to come. They're generally in this waiting room, waiting for their permits for like 6 months. So why not use those 6 months, to start training them on languages, right? So when I said mainstreaming all of this into the pathways, that's also what I meant, right? So we're mainstreaming the language courses that exist for newcomers into the pathway so that people pre-departure can access them and can get as far as possible in already learning the language. It facilitates everything, of course, down the line. Once you arrive, once you maybe need to take a complementary training, a complementary course, and then obviously once you get into the job and you need to start exchanging with your colleagues. So language definitely one of them. I would maybe also, as a challenge, also add the issue that I would call employer reluctance. I think sometimes I have the feeling that some stakeholders take it for granted that there is employer interest. Well, yes and no, right? Marina has just shared the numbers. Definitely there are employers that are interested, exploring with us, engaging with us, but it's not the majority, right? So I think that we're also facing a situation where we need to talk to a lot of employers to get only some of them that engage. If you put yourself in their shoes, of course, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're like, this seems such a complicated option. Can I not just find a local hire, an EU hire, or, a Western Hemisphere hire before I go into the fourth option that is maybe a complementary pathway, right? So there's a lot of reluctance. I think it's normal that they're a bit scared about all of this. They see risks, they see costs, they see a lot of administration, things they need to do, before these people can actually come in. And I think that we're now a little bit at a tipping point with the talents that are coming in, with the proof of concept that is there, where we say, relax, we know how it works. You can count on us, all these stakeholders, this whole team, to accompany you in all of this. We'll go through it together. And that is often then indeed the fact that it has worked for others, that it has been successful for others. More and more indeed also a point where you see that they are tipping and that they are saying, okay, where I would have been reluctant and I would have said maybe another time, hopefully now we can get a bit more of traction also from the employer point of view. But I keep on saying an employer pipeline is the starting point for a complementary pathway, right? Most of all, right? Because without employer pipeline, you can have hundreds of thousands of talents in the talent catalog, but you need, again, to connect them with these employers. So there is still a considerable effort, I think, to be done there to prove the concept and to keep on pitching it and explaining it so that it can indeed also be mainstreams into the habits of bigger employers, of HR companies, and so forth. So I would say those are the key challenges. Maybe on the employer side, what you typically see also is that employers, they often come to us with the one profile they never find, right? Like with all of these unbelievable criteria, someone that speaks 12 languages, that has 3 engineering diplomas, and you're like, you're asking us to find that person. I mean, you never found it. In any case, how are we going to find it, right? So So that is sometimes also in the balance, they pick out that vacancy where they think like, yes, if this is an option, yeah, let's give it a try and let's see what happens. Obviously, it's very complicated to dive into these very, very specific vacancies. I think what we see there is that we're shifting a bit to a hire, train, move model, right? Where we say, we're not going to find that person either, right? With all of those requirements and all of those skills. However, what we can think of with you is to try to find people that have the attitude, the competences to learn, and see whether we can get these people into a trajectory where we train them first to meet your expectations, and then after that move them and hire them actually, right? And so that is an interesting development as well, I think, where we say it's going to be very difficult, to match everyone and to have great matches. But we have other things that we could think of. Ideally, I think we would do that in kind of classroom format. If you would need to do that individual by individual, it would be super costly. But if you could get people into a classroom and get employers to hire through cohorts, so multiple people at once, potentially you can scale it a bit, keep the cost under control, and that could be another alternative to that question. So those, I think, were the main challenges from my side.
Great, thank you so much. So to summarize those, integration, housing, language, and like skills, like parallel skills and accreditation, and then finally employer reluctance. And luckily for all of you, we have workshops on those so you can help us find a solution. And that's, I guess, the idea of this conference, to say we know that there are these challenges. And as Rob was speaking, the sun was coming in and out. It was really, I don't know if you noticed that, but that's probably how we feel as a project team in DT4E. There is, light and shade. Rob, I'm going to stay with you, so if you can keep the mic. And this was actually one of your standby questions, but I'm going to lift it up. We've spoken about hire, train, and move, and talking about housing partners, integration, etc. All of that relies on partnerships. Can you talk a little bit about some of the partnerships that have been developed through DT4E, and maybe some that have been most surprising to you as we've moved through the program?
Yeah, there's a lot of partnerships that have developed, and some of them indeed were difficult to materialize, because indeed you have existing habits, existing organizations with existing mandates in existing frameworks, right? And sometimes we ask these organizations to step out of those frameworks, to change their mandates, and to think with us on how these complementary pathways could become more effective. I think on the Belgian side, we're particularly happy with the traction that we got also from some of the government agencies on thinking with us. I was mentioning the language. I think that's one of them. It's interesting to see that there was this openness to provide the language courses pre-departure. It's the same for integration. In Belgium, you have a well-established integration pathway. As a newcomer, you're expected to take some courses. It starts with Fedasil, but then you have in the regions in Belgium, so decentralized integration agencies that take you by the hand and that guide you through an integration trajectory. In principle, again, these are available for people that are physically here. Due to COVID, a lot of these things were digitalized. So you have a lot of these modules now that are fantastic, super well designed, and that you can access on your computer. And so we then ask the question like, what about, these people stepping into this trajectory, early on, right? Pre-departure, right? Getting a bit of a sense of what is going to happen in Belgium, exactly as Katrien said. What is this country? What language do they speak? How does it work over there? And so on. And so we've piloted, we've tested that also with the agencies to see like, would it work? How would it work? How do these people then connect to the class? Because they're basically in a classroom with people that are here, but they are still, pre-departure. How does that influence the role of the teacher, and so on and so on. So we're really trying to mainstream all of that into a trajectory that is also from, I think, a talent point of view, more coherent, right? Because typically what you would have seen, a few years ago from a talent point of view is that you would have, at different steps, a different actor in front of you that would tell you, and now do this, and then do that. And sometimes these actors, they were not coordinated. So sometimes I think you would have felt like, I have to do this again now with another actor, and then, you know, I have to fill this form again now because now I'm in this stage. What we're trying to build is also coherence from the talent point of view, so that your starting point is the same for everyone, and that your end point, you know, once you're in the country, it's a continuum of things, right? And it's not just jump from one step to the other, and then first it's IOM that takes care of you, then it's TBB, then it's Fedasil, and then it's the integration agency. Why not mainstream that into one trajectory where all of these entities co-design the whole trajectory, and from a talent point of view, you have a smooth and coherent pathways that makes a lot of sense. So I think those are the things where we found, like, you know, we're stepping out of the regular frameworks, the regular mandates, and we're exploring possibilities to open that up so that these complementary pathways can become more successful.
Fantastic. And I think that focus on the candidate journey is really important, and having partners play a role in the entire journey, in the entire curve, but also speak the same language and be able to reference each other, rather than to use the candidate as the conduit of information to say, oh, this person told me that, and so now I have to do this. So that cohesion is really important. Before I pass to Gemma, I just want to say we're going to pause very shortly for some questions. So this is the challenges part. I wonder if there are any questions in the audience or any comments that you guys are thinking about, so that we can involve you in this discussion. But as you're thinking about that, I want to ask you, Gemma, we're obviously talking here about a project, a singular journey, etc. But in fact, something that my colleague Daniele constantly reminds me of is Europe is not one place. And there is a tendency, you know, DT4E Europe. But the reality is we are operating in 4 separate countries with different languages, with different immigration systems, with different reception trends, etc. So from a candidate experience, the first interaction with that is going to be the visa. So Gemma, can you talk a little bit about the legal differences between the different countries, and maybe if there are any common threads around them for the visa and the mobility aspects of DT4E?
Absolutely, thank you. So I suppose to start with the last question, in terms of common threads, I think what typifies our approach throughout DT4E, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, is not trying to reinvent the wheel when it came to establishing the pilots. It was looking at what we already had and considering how we make small adjustments to facilitate displaced talent mobility. And that was a starting point within all of the countries. And you know, I think it also makes good sense when you are first approaching governments. You're not asking them to sort of undertake this huge reassessment with you. It's just a very palatable suggestion that there are small changes that can be made to absolutely widen the stream of potential talent coming into the country. So it makes it a very good sell, as is the proof in the figures to which Marina referenced earlier. So to focus on the UK to start with, I do that because that's my particular area, but also I suppose from a DT4E perspective, the UK was in a slightly more advanced position when we started the project, in that we already had our pilot in place with the Home Office, so we were slightly ahead of the game there. We're very fortunate in that we have a centralized application process. We just work with the UK Visas and Immigration, which is a department of the Home Office. So having one government department, a centralized application process is all very streamlined, all very straightforward. We're also fortunate in that we have all of our law and guidance online, which might sound obvious, but whenever you do sort of international benchmarking, looking at different immigration schemes worldwide, that's not always a common theme. So in the UK, it really is an advantage because the law is there in black and white, as is the relevant guidance. So it really allows us to make those applications in a scheme that is predictable, where you can anticipate the response. It's points-based. So if you have the relevant points, you should get the visa. That's very black and white, and it really allows predictability for the individual applicant and for the business, which is a real positive. In Ireland, in contrast to the UK, for example, there's different government departments throughout the immigration process, which means the system, it's slightly more truncated, still very, very smooth process, but it's just in contrast to the UK, there's a slight degree of separation with the different government departments, which is an interesting compare and contrast. In Belgium, again, there's a regional model, so that's very different to the UK, to Ireland. As Rob alluded, there's the language requirements, which are very specific. Again, in the UK, we do have those, but when you think about English as a global language, in terms of the talent available within the talent catalogue, that's a skill which is readily available. Portugal is also interesting. When we first started the pilot, one of our main concerns was around dependents being able to travel with the main applicants. As was alluded to earlier, the dependent experience is so important. At Fragomen, we always say the success of a move, it stands and it falls on the experience of the dependents. It is not just about the main applicant, but in particular, when you're dealing with people from a displaced background, the ability for family to travel with them at the same time, or at least to have the assurance that they can have trailing family members, is absolutely critical. We were really fortunate that over the course of the pilot, the law actually changed in December 2022 to facilitate the dependent moves. But again, it's just to reiterate the point that Marina made, these are all different systems. They all have their nuances. So it's incredibly important to be mindful of that from the outset at the very design stage to try to anticipate those issues. But that was, again, you know, it might sound like having the UK be slightly out of step with the other countries might make things difficult, but actually we were able to take lessons learned from that experience and apply it as best practice. As Marina mentioned earlier, one of the really positive elements of the UK system is that we have a dedicated desk with the Home Office. So it means when we have cases that present as just that little bit unusual, slightly peculiar, we have those really open lines of communication where we can just approach the Home Office and say, this is the situation, this is our pragmatic solution, what do you think? And invariably that they're on board with that and they really help us work through that process. So when we came to trying to envisage the pilots in the other countries, bearing in mind how useful that had been, we tried to make that an integral part of the pitch to the government. So it's a very obvious lesson learnt, which was applied as part of best practice moving forward. And I think that's something that's stood us in really good stead as part of DT4E and will inform DT4E 2.0 and the project as a whole as we continue to scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just 2 quick points on visas and sort of the legal instruments for displaced talent mobility. The first is that the European region is unique in that it is a temporary visa in the first instance. Unlike Canada and Australia, which offer permanent residence on arrival, Europe is temporary. And that is something we're constantly asked about. And our response to that is it's a matter of being informed about the decision to move on a temporary visa. It's about understanding that we need to build in protection safeguards if, as Gemma said, there is the worst case scenario of a job, a redundancy or moving on, etc., or a family breakdown. But it is a matter of empowerment, agency and autonomy, which we really value as a principle of DT4E, where if a candidate is informed about the fact that they're coming on a temporary visa, they can then make a decision as to whether they'd like to take that opportunity or not. And so that's a really important nuance, but it is something that we can think about in the future, but I'll leave that comment to you later on, Gemma. The other thing is the visa to a particular country is not the solution. I know colleagues from UNHCR, we're constantly in discussions around travel documents. So in the UK, candidates who are unable to secure a passport are able to be issued a UK travel document so as to be able to enter, and then a travel document so as to be able to travel. But to travel is a problem. Even for this conference, we have had candidates, alumni, who could have joined Khaled, who were refused a Schengen visa because they don't have enough incentive to return to their home country, which was the UK. The journey does not end with actually just getting a job and moving here. And that's really problematic for someone in a consulting job. If you need to be here for a conference and you can't, the barriers don't end just because you have moved to the UK, you've moved to Ireland, you've moved to Belgium. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done around the legal perspective. While it's still glum outside, I'm going to stick with challenges. Katrien, can you talk a little bit about what you think the biggest challenges are for sort of newcomers into Belgium in terms of community integration, and what mechanisms or what partnerships can be used to lift out of that?
Okay.
I would like to come back on the challenge that Rob already mentioned. Accommodation housing is really a key issue, not only because it's important, but also because it's the first step in the integration in Belgium. For example, also legally, you need to have an accommodation before you can register at the municipality. You need to be registered at the municipality before you can get a health insurance. Also, finding schools for your children is difficult if you don't know where you're going to live. So this accommodation issue is really big, not only for the people in this project, but in general in Belgium, and even more for refugees or displaced people. And that's also why inside of Fedasil we decided to really create a housing team that's going to start quite soon, I hope. And that we also launched a project call on housing, because I think we really need innovative solutions for housing. And then the second thing, well, in general, people need to feel welcomed in the country where they arrive. We really strongly believe in community sponsorship. I think it's a model that we have some experience on here in Belgium. For example, on the other educational pathway that we work on from Fedasil. It's a way where a group of sponsors or a group of volunteers are get together to really welcome a person and to guide this person in Belgian society. And it works well. And I think we could try to explore how this could work in companies as well. Maybe there might be companies that, especially bigger companies, that are really looking for a kind of social project, and that are willing to see among the colleagues if they don't want to create this kind of sponsor group. So that's something to explore.
Excellent. Taking pause now for any questions. Okay. Oh, yes. If you could just say your name and where you're from, that would be great. There's a mic coming. There's a mic coming.
Hi, thank you. I'm Fedasil with the Migration Youth and Children Platform. I'm not sure if this is a question or more of a comment, but I noticed that a lot of the times in the labor mobility discussions, it's obviously a lot about talent and skills. But a lot of the times we also forget about the educational aspect. So what do we do for young migrants who have diplomas and not necessarily the talent or expertise to come to or to have a displacement opportunity because maybe they don't have the talent or skills yet? I don't know if any of you in terms of experts can answer to that, but it's just something that I find is really missing in the labor migration discourse, and how we can, as a community, I don't know, fill in that gap, or is this a gap that is just going to exist because of other issues?
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for that. That's a really interesting question. Thank you very much. And what I would say is that, you know, there are education pathways opening up around the world. I saw news that the US Welcome Corps, for example, have started such a pathway, and in fact have students arriving now. And so, yeah, so what's interesting in my mind is that how do you sort of create the sort of internal environment government that allows you to pull through those who have come through on an education pathway into a skilled worker arrangement. There are obviously some barriers and concerns you need to ameliorate when you're and address when you're looking at education pathways, particularly you know, we're talking about young people who have come from a very hard background often, who are then going to an education establishment. What happens if they don't complete their course? You know, it may happen for, you know, the best of reasons. It's you know, it does happen. So what about what happens then? And also, you know, you have to think about, well, how do you create a situation where they go from their education pathway into a skilled worker role that addresses the certain gap that's related to the education course they took, and how do you make that happen? How do you prevent a situation where someone comes in and does astrophysics or whatever, and then goes works at their cousin's restaurant in Worthing? So yeah, how do you sort of prevent that sort of situation? So those would be the sort of kind of things I would be thinking of, when considering how you bring people, upskilling them in your country and then transitioning them to a skilled worker route.
Yeah, the hybridity of the complementary pathways is a really interesting one. Hopefully, as we develop the hire, train and move model more and more, there is an opportunity to lift out of what existing experience is and not. Some employers are really interested in young talent because they don't want to spend the time helping someone unlearn habits. And so some of the work that we've done with the NHS was really for young graduates, like fresh graduates. In fact, we had twins who moved through a cohort and they celebrated their 21st birthday on like 2 weeks after they arrived, with the cohort of nurses that arrived. So I think that it's a matter of the demand of the employer, unfortunately, and the willingness of the employer, but it's also our pitch. But I know, Gemma, you wanted to add something as well.
No, thank you so much. And I think, it's a great question. Thank you. I suppose to focus on the UK as an example, and sort of point to which Chris alluded earlier, how the pilot has developed. Initially, it was aimed at people who were qualified to degree level, who were coming to the UK to do a degree level role. Our system has now since changed. So the work permit on which we focus as part of the Displaced Talent pilot allows people to come to the UK to do what we call in the UK an A-level role. So that's school leaver. So it then makes it a little bit more accessible to people from that particular education background. And we also have a degree of nuance around the minimum salary that's required. So people who are that little bit younger, who are just entering the labour market, it's obviously anticipated they're not going to command as high a salary as somebody who has 10 years of experience. So there's a dispensation to allow them to still qualify for the visa on a slightly lower salary. So that there are some mechanisms of flex there. But I agree that it's certainly a really interesting element to explore. I think, as Chris mentioned, within the UK, there absolutely are student visa routes, but they are not what we would typically call a durable solution because they allow you to come to the UK for a fixed period in line with your period of study. There are dispensations which facilitate applications from within the UK for students into the skilled worker route, but because a student visa isn't in of itself a route to settlement in the UK, it can prove difficult as part of a displaced talent pathway. But yeah, absolutely something to think about, because exactly as Rob mentioned earlier, what we're working towards is normalizing displaced talent mobility to the extent that when employers think about who am I going to hire for this role, they're thinking about local graduates, they're thinking about the resident labour market, but they're also thinking about displaced talent. And, if we can facilitate that with learning as part of the process, then that just expands that labour pool even further. So it's definitely something to bear in mind. Thank you.
Great question. Another one.
Bonjour, my name is Sergei Kasyanov. I'm from Ukraine. The question, I have a master in public administration from Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Who is better to apply to in order to find employment in Belgium? Thank you.
Yes, if I understood well, the question was who can apply to find employment? Sorry? Yes, to apply. I mean, the way the DT4E program has been designed is, of course, to have displaced talents in Jordan and Lebanon and give those the opportunity to apply for jobs here in Belgium. We get that question quite often. Refugees that are here, refugees that are in other countries, can they apply? How do they apply? And so forth. So I think somebody mentioned earlier on that we're also opening up, when we're scaling these pathways, the source countries. And so we'll be expanding also to other countries, not only Jordan and Lebanon. But for instance, for people that would physically already be here in Belgium, refugees and others, the DT4E is not designed for those. Obviously, there's other projects, there's other pathways for these people that might be interesting. So we try to connect some of these. We've done it in the healthcare sector here in Belgium, where you have so much shortages in the healthcare that actually for all the asylum seekers that are with Fedasil, first thing they do is to see, are there any healthcare profiles in there, right? These people are physically here, they're in reception centers and so forth. Yes, some of them, but not enough to cover all the needs. And so we've then agreed with this existing pathway that we could bring DT4E healthcare talents to that same pathway, which includes also stakeholders here in Belgium, which also has a funding component, very interesting also to lower the cost of our complementary pathway, and to bring these foreign displaced talent that are still in Jordan and Lebanon into the Belgian labor market. So sometimes we connect it, but our main objective for DT4E has been to give the opportunity to displaced people in Jordan and Lebanon.
Thank you, Rob. Sorry?
Others and others, indeed, yes.
Thank you. I think, you know, I know that we've got some questions online and we'll take them shortly, but I think some of the, as we get different questions, we're just seeing that there is so much more that this program can do and can evolve into. And so I think a lot of our challenges, we're in this sort of challenges space, is to think about how do we nuance and what strategies do we take? Do we focus on young people? What country do we focus on? Where do we develop these classrooms for hire, train and move? What partnerships do we build? Again, that is why we have developed the workshops as part of this program, so that you can all help us contribute and help us navigate that so that we can see what's possible, because I think there is a lot to do and there's a lot left for us to do. Speaking of different angles, I think when you talk about displaced talent mobility, there are different ways of conceptualizing it. There's obviously the humanitarian angle of lifting people out of displacement and securing futures through safe and regular migration. There's also the economic arguments, and that's what we often refer to as the win-win. Chris, if I could just pass to you and just ask if you could share any sort of data or insights or approaches from a government policy perspective around the long-term economic contributions of displaced workers and what that's meant sort of in your policy development in this area.
Hi, yes. So when it comes to economic policy development and the sort of economic contribution of those who've come through on our displaced talents scheme, our assessment is something like, oh, here we are. So it's £1 million a year through tax contributions and national insurance contributions. That's the assessment cleverer people than I have come to. Don't ask me how they do it. Some sort of economic wizardry. But yeah, and hope it's not for me. So yeah, so that's the figure they come to, and what I'm not including in that figure is potential savings you've made through as you know, those who come through on the UK's pilot come through on the skilled worker visa, so therefore they're not entitled to the integration support that other refugees that refugees get who claimed asylum. We recognize them as displaced people who come through on the displaced talent pilot. And so that's a factor as well, although that is, you know, that is not the sort of, that's not the primary purpose of why we're doing it, but that's just something to factor in as well. And what I would say, and this is interesting in and of itself, is that in our thinking hasn't really evolved beyond that, sort of those sort of headlines. And I think one thing that's quite interesting, and it's sort of, Rob alluded to earlier about how DT4E sort of integrates itself with what's going on with the member states. I mean, we also have to think a lot more about how we integrate what we do with the people who really care about skill shortages within the UK government. You know, the likes of you know, the business department, the energy department. the science department, you know, who are, and their view is, and their role is to try and address those skills shortages. You know, that's not really a primary purpose for the Home Office, although it is something we should definitely be considering as we develop our policy. You know, if you look at what the objectives of what the Home Office is for, it's around, you know, internal national security. It's about, you know, managing both legal migration and preventing illegal migration, and also law and order. So you know, that's when it comes to our policy development, that's the prism through which internally the Home Office looks at things. But how we sort of make those links with the people whose policy objectives are around addressing skills shortages, even when the internal framework of government is you know, is definitely something you know, I would suggest we should probably be focusing on more. And I'd encourage you to also make those sort of similar links in your own policy development. Thank you.
That sets up really well to think about policies for the future and how to sort of embed, as Rob says, DT4E in the mainstream, which will take us to the final sort of section of this panel, which is really forward-looking and future-looking. So we're going to get back into being optimistic at the moment. Chris, you alluded to almost like cross-government initiatives maybe, and I think we're already starting to see that in the UK with the Department of Health and Social Care, the Department for Education, net zero energy and net zero. You've spoken a little bit about even thinking about costing and how this is framed. Acknowledging that we've just had an election and a new government and policies are not set, and this is not an investigative journalistic question. What do you expect, or if you can't expect, what do you hope the UK government's short and medium terms sort of visions or plans or commitments are going to be for displaced talent mobility?
Yeah, and I'm very sorry to give a terribly bureaucratic answer to this, but unfortunately we have this awkward thing called democracy. Maybe you've come across it. I strongly recommend against it. Don't quote me on that. That's not. That's a joke, by the way. A UK Home Office official said. Yeah, and so we've got a new government who's come in place over the summer. They have not yet given a view on the future of our lawful pathways, and that's mainly because they're getting up to speed with what all the issues are. It's a new cabinet, a new government, new ministers, and we had rioting over the summer as well. So that's taken that's drawn a lot of their focus on sort of, you know, that law and order objective I spoke about earlier. That's been a lot of their focus over the summer. And so as I say, we've got no view yet on the future of the law of lawful pathways, and that includes our displaced talent pilot. What I would say is that this is, even within the UK, it's wider than the Home Office. There are still initiatives happening within the UK that related to displaced talent that aren't to do with the displaced talent pilot. The Department of Health has a specific scheme about attracting healthcare talent into the UK, and that's been very successful. They've had something like 200 people come through that scheme. I understand also so Welsh and Scottish governments are looking at this as well, and running initiatives at attracting internal talent. So you know, wherever we land on this with our ministers, that you know that there will still be sort of there will still be interest in displaced talent within the UK.
We'll take it. Interest to explore. And you're also here, Chris, so you're top on the Eurostar, so thanks for that. That's a very strong indication we're in the right direction. Rob, I'm going to pass to you. Again, we're forward-looking. We've learned a lot of lessons. Based on success stories, what do you hope will happen? But also, what sort of lessons do you think we pass on as we think about DT4E 2.0, the STEP program, and initiatives that we're starting in Germany and across the continent?
No. I think Chris is also right in pointing out that the political element plays a role, of course. And I think we also had just elections here in Belgium, like in a lot of Western European countries. It doesn't look that promising. If we would imagine maybe that, you know, policymakers would adapt the frameworks, would show more flexibility and all of that, I would think possibly not. So we will have to work with that and around that. I think from my point of view, the whole complementary pathway system is a demand-driven system. So it all starts with, I want to hire these people. So the more employers we get on board, the more employer representatives we get on board, the stronger the message will also be vis-a-vis the authorities. So I think we will continue doing that advocacy. We will continue explaining, you know, what the obstacles are and arguing that we need a bit more flexibility to make this more successful. But it will depend heavily on also how much employers we have with us, I think. So that is something to work on in the future. In terms of lessons, yes, I think we've really in DT4E learned a lot from the Anglo-Saxon models. We've talked about the UK, but we have Canada, we have Australia also. We've learned that the EU member states are really also different from certain perspectives, right? So it looked in the beginning like we'll just copy what those guys did and then everything will run smoothly, but in reality it didn't work so smoothly, right? It was actually not so easily transposable, the systems, or there was also definitely in some cases not enough political will to actually transpose these kind of models. And so in the EU, I think it's still, you know, the frameworks as such exist and we're navigating those, as you explained, but they're not necessarily designed for these kind of complementary pathways. So I think that when you look at the future, when you think of, you know, getting more countries on board, scaling them, getting more people into the pathways, getting more employers on board, you know, that's where the difficulties will lie. I think we've proven that it can be done. We have small groups that are actually in our pathways, but how do we get that to a higher level, right? I think it also relates to the funding. For instance, we need to start thinking of, you know, yes, these things have a price. The budgets of our projects are quite significant. How can we, again, get all of these stakeholders on board and carry some of that cost as well, right? I think those are also steps. I feel that we're at this point where we have, you know, these discussions on you as an employer. So far, you kind of got a bit of a free lunch because we organized everything for you. But how can we then now take that a step further? How can you cover some of those costs? And the same with all the other stakeholders, right? If you're with us on this, you've tested it now, you've seen how it works. How far are you willing to go also to support this, you know, in terms of putting, you know, effort months in it, but potentially also putting some of the funding in there. So I think that those will be the critical elements for the coming years, especially in the countries of DT4E, where we've went through the piloting. It will be interesting to see with Slovakia and France coming on board how the EU member states that were in the first project will now be looked at as an example for these two newcomers. And so hopefully we can also take a bit of speed there and go a little bit faster than what we had in our first project. So I think that those are the elements looking at the future that will be on the table, and yeah, very excited to work on it. But again, I think there will be obstacles and it will be a road with quite some bumps.
Very pragmatic hope for expansion and scale. Gemma, to you now. Can you talk a little bit about what the future of displaced talent mobility is from an immigration law perspective? And I have here on my notes, I was like, note, be bold. So this might be very optimistic and utopian, but Gemma, over to you.
Thank you. I shall indeed be bold. No, I mean, I think the figures that were quoted earlier shows that through Displaced Talent for Europe, what we've shown is that displaced talent labour mobility is a viable solution that can be scaled across Europe. I think exactly both Chris and Rob have alluded to the political element. I mean, immigration is never far from politics. It's absolutely, the two are so thoroughly entwined. And when we look at global immigration trends, when we experience difficult economic circumstances, to which Marina alluded earlier in terms of record inflation, etc., we quite often see restrictive immigration practices in response to that. the UK is a prime example where it's been a challenging backdrop in that over the last 12 months, we've seen the government fees increase exponentially. And we've also seen the minimum salary level required for the visas increase. So it creates a challenging environment, but what's good about that is that then it's incumbent upon us to respond creatively, to think holistically about how we address those. And I think what we've seen in the UK in particular, as has been mentioned, is that some of the best successes, they come from necessity. So in the UK, our healthcare pilot has been immensely successful. So during the pandemic, the UK government introduced the health and social care visa, which was specifically for individuals coming to the UK to work within care as nurses, etc., which is in response to acute and chronic labour shortages in the UK. So but that completely epitomizes how displaced talent is supposed to work. If you think of an egg timer, you have the National Health Service in the UK with critical labour shortages. You have in Lebanon a wealth of Palestinian refugees with amazing nursing skills. So the job of displaced talent is to take that pinch point in the middle and just stretch it so those individuals can come and you connect those two populations. And that's absolutely brilliant. So as we look forward, we think about the other necessities that present itself. I think the most apparent of which is the green transition. So that is something which is an issue at a global level, certainly at an EU level. And I'm conscious of someone from the UK talking about EU issues. I would reassure it's a UK issue as well. If we look at the need for heat pump installation in the UK, for example, it's anticipated that by 2028, the UK will need 27,000 skilled individuals to do that. At the moment, we have 3,000. In the EU, it's a similar picture where there's a doubling of labour shortages in the green skill area from 2015 to 2021. Specific to heat pump installations, the EU anticipates needing an additional 500,000 individuals to do that by 2030. So the talent catalogue has a wealth of skills, individuals who already have the skills, who just need a little bit of cross training. It's not even upskilling, it's just sort of skilling in a slightly different direction in order to meet those chronic labour needs. In the UK government have set themselves a legal mandate to meet that challenge. They can do that by focusing and really tapping in to displaced talent. But in the EU, the green transition and a labour shortage in relation to green skills is an EU-wide problem, which needs an EU-wide solution, which is an EU directive on displaced talent, because we can do it country by country, and indeed we will. But what would be a lot easier and really scale the solution to this endemic problem would be a European directive, which would facilitate displaced talent on a grand scale and ties, and as Anita alluded earlier, to the wonderful ongoing work around the European talent pool. So there's a real synergy there, and I think we can look to that as an ultimate solution.
A great one. Sounds so simple, an EU directive for displaced talent, but we'll work towards it. We've got a few years. I just want to pick up on the recommendation around displaced talent, tapping into the green transition. There was a wonderful piece of research done by our colleague Claire Kumar, who's in the room, from ODI, and one of the top 5 recommendations for the green transition in Ireland and the UK was to tap into displaced talent mobility. So again, lots of opportunity, and I think that optimism, together with making sure that we're advocating with employers, with governments, is going to send us in the right direction. I think we can't, as we've heard on this panel, ignore or not think about integration. So Katrien, can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned Fedasil establishing a housing team, and we talked a little bit about challenges, but what maybe are your hopes? So you mentioned a little bit about community sponsorship as well. Where do you see integration going, and what's your hope in terms of displaced talent mobility and the role of Fedasil and community in that?
Well, if I can really dream, we don't have a housing crisis anymore. But no, I think I'm a bit more optimistic than some other people in the panel. For Belgium, for example, if you look at the political party programs of all the political parties that are now negotiating the new government, all of them have explicitly mentioned in their programs that legal migration, safe, regular, controlled, etc. migration is what they want. So maybe we should be hopeful and think that they will put an effort on resettlement and complementary pathways. I really hope that we can scale up the pilot projects that we did now, and that we can move away all the barriers that still exists. And I do think that there might be political will, but let's be hopeful. Yeah, thanks.
So expansion, scale, a directive, partnerships, just keep going in the same direction, but just be bigger and bolder. I'm going to leave the last comment before we wrap up to questions with Khaled. And I would like you to make a call to action. What advice would you give employers, governments, partners around displaced talent mobility, given that you are one of our success stories?
So what can I have like some points for the employers and governments, starting with the employers. They can introduce a buddy system work. We'll go through this into tomorrow in the integration panel into more details of this. But I think the buddy system, which I believe, because I lived this experience, I go with my colleague every day to work. It's very good opportunity to welcome the talent, the refugee, to be integrated into the work environment and the country itself. Of course, training, because my other colleague who went from Lebanon to Ireland, he literally like first 2 weeks, it was very, very hard for him, but actually first months, because he thought he was coming to work like in a different type of work. Okay, he applied. It's like the job description was, he thought he would be working like an office, not outside on site. I had the experience, 8 years of experience. I know exactly what was the job. I'll be doing technical job, but so providing training helped him a lot. So the employers, if they do like trainings for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, they will like invest in this refugee. And to for the government, right? Like to promote the diversity and to hire people on their potential, not on their credentials. Offer incentives to like and work closely with IOM and TBB, because it's the only way that the refugee could secure a job and invest in these countries. And finally, the process, maybe the government could simplify the process of the migration of the labor refugees, because sometimes we're facing like a lot of troubles with the process because of our paperwork. Like my travel document has never changed. Like my father, my grandfather, for 75 years, it's the same travel document. And every time we're facing problem with the embassy, with when we're applying for like resident permits or whatever, like official documents. So it's the same document. It will never change except when I get like a citizenship maybe or something. So I hope that they can do something regarding to support in the process and the official works to simplify our official documents. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very practical solutions there. Thank you. 15 minutes remaining. Enough time for questions. And whoa, okay, sorry. There were a few hands that were shot straight up. First question will go to Fatima down the front here.
Better now? Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I really feel like I learned a lot from everyone's insights. And Rob, I really loved your comment on building a pipeline of employers to buy into displaced talent and DT4E and STEP and DT4E 2.0. I guess what incentives can we give governments to buy into these projects? What more can we give them besides, I guess, talent? Yes.
It's a good question. I think there's a number of things that we can do. I think explaining them what this process looks like, what their responsibilities are, what the potential risks are on their side is one of the critical first steps, I think. you typically in the beginning, you hear questions where you think like, where does this come from? For instance, employers would say, what happens if it goes wrong, right? Am I then responsible for that person? Do I need to bring that person back to another country, or how would that work, right? And that is surprising to us because we would think like, of course not. No, I mean, those are the kind of things that we would then discuss with the government and say like, if the plan A doesn't work, what would be the plan B? And if plan B doesn't work, what would be plan C, right? But it's very important to explain that carefully and to list it up, right? So that the employers know exactly, you know, what is expected from them, what the risks are, but also what the costs are, because employers, they also think of this thing looks so complex, so costly, let me go for the alternative, right? Maybe that's easier and less costly, right? I think yes and no. In a lot of cases, we have partners on board, we have subsidies from governments that can help us also in keeping those costs low enough. So I think critically important is to, especially for the ones that start with this, is to be very clear on how this would work. Ideally, you would have proof of concept, you would have a neighbor that has done it before, and you would connect the two and say, talk to your neighbor, they've done it before, they can explain also a little bit on how it worked. But then on top of that, I think indeed accompanying the employer in all of these steps. It's about the administration, yes, filling in the documents, the permits and all of that. But it's also the transformation process that sometimes is required at the workplace. How are you going to, you know, bring in these displaced talents into your existing team? Is your team ready for that? Are you ready for that? Did you think about it? You know, what does research show? What do practices show? It's not going to be business as usual. And you would probably have to think it through and see how you also adapt inside the structures of your company. There's a lot of people that have a lot of expertise on this. So connecting the employers to these people, making sure that these discussions are taking place, making sure that the staff at the employer, the management at the employer is ready for this. Those are all elements, I think, that can help. We typically ask employers whether we can keep on monitoring what happens, right? Once the talents are on board. So every few months we ask them, and so how's it going, right? Both to the hiring manager and to the talent. And from that, you learn a lot, right? Because then you get comments like, yes, you know, technically fine, but, you know, there's a number of things that I want to talk about because there's a lot of friction, you know, on certain issues, right? And so I think then capturing that friction and looking into what is this about, you know, and how come that this occurs, right? And what can we do about it? That is, I find, also very, very, very important. So for me, the fact that you have employers that are open enough to say, happy that you monitor, happy that you come and ask some questions every few months so that I can learn, the talent can learn, we connect all of those dots, we bring in expertise if that is needed, we can do a training course, we can do whatever, you know, but we need to first identify it, right? And so that is true for soft skills, communication, norms, values, a lot of these things that are often not very tangible, very visible. We talked the whole panel about skills, diplomas and so on. So the whole process is designed on the skill level. And we sometimes tend to forget that there's all these other elements, right, that also play a role in this being successful or not. And I think engaging the employers, showing them also that there's so many solutions, because they often see it as a risk, a problem. Am I going to be able to do that? What is going to be my responsibility? Maybe this is going to backfire. And so I think bringing forward those solutions, bringing forward all the ones that have done it before and that have shown that it can be done, that is potentially part of our job, I think, in trying to convince them to take those steps and those initial first steps, which are often the most difficult ones.
And if I may, just to expand upon that, I think Rob's absolutely right to speak to the really important role that employer ambassadors can play. So Fragomen can very proudly be part of that because we've also hired through Talent Beyond Boundaries under the Displaced Talent for Europe auspices. To the point that was made earlier, it originally started off with a focus on Lebanon and Jordan, but our 2 hires actually came from Afghanistan. You know, that's a situation that occurred during the lifetime of the pilot where there was suddenly a huge Afghan diaspora. So we now have 2 individuals based in our Sheffield office doing absolutely sterling work. And I think the being so closely involved with the program meant that we knew exactly how it worked. We knew exactly how the process would work. And when we went through that recruitment element, TBB arranged it so it mirrored precisely how we recruit normally. And then we got support from IOM on the integration piece, which was absolutely brilliant. We also have within the UK a specific displaced legal talent initiative where we, Fragomen, were hiring along with a cohort of other law firms, which is a really, really effective mechanism because then we learn from one another the issues that arose within specifically a legal context in terms of background checks, for example, which can prove to be a little bit difficult. But we met with Talent Beyond Boundaries regularly, as did our individuals as part of their wonderful monitoring and evaluation process, just to make sure, we were taking those lessons learned and we were responding accordingly. So I do think that those employee ambassadors form a really important part of that program to encourage that involvement and show that this absolutely is an employer-led solution. Thank you.
If I could just add that I think some of the incentive is strategy, right? So we invite employers to think about this as a workforce planning solution. So you have graduates, you have local hires, you have international hires, you have displaced talent mobility hires. And so that already shifts the perspective to be like, this is super strategic, it's diverse, but it's also changing the way we're doing global mobility. And a lot of companies sign on to that. I think to Rob and Gemma's point, it's also the incentive of being supported through the program. And I think it is this aspect of being pioneering, which a lot of employers really value. And there's nothing like a legislative requirement of meeting net zero to push things along. So really tapping into that is another incentive. We might go to some online questions.
Yes, thank you, Marina. We've got some questions online. Thank you for everyone who is online right now. First question from Clara Rodas. She's asking, what is the current involvement of DT4E in Spain? And what are the next steps for the development of these programs in Spain?
Great question. So it's not DT4E that's going to Spain. It's another program called STEP. So that was a program that started earlier this year. And the project team is now working on a baseline assessment, which is usually our first step where we look at what already exists, what needs to adapt, and what a pilot would look like. So together with the partners of STEP, many of whom are in the room today, we're going to be developing that baseline assessment and then looking at the partnerships and the ecosystem we need to build. So watch this space for Spain. I might go to another question in the room here. There's one at the front.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting discussion, sharing of experiences for the overall project. I'm Marta Feio from the Portuguese Migration Agency. I have one question. Considering this whole debate about how to capture talent, the issues on housing and education that we have that is linked to it, how do you see the willingness of companies and employers also to support people coming from abroad to be integrated and support them in providing also the housing, the education, and the conditions they need to have a full integration package? Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. No, excellent question. I mean, from what I see, there's a big diversity out there of employers. So there's not like one answer, like how willing are they? It depends really. I think if you look at bigger companies, multinational companies, typically they have established schemes for getting people on board, training people and so forth. And so a lot of them have CSR, corporate social responsibility policies. They try to also embed, some of the things that we do in there. They try to connect it. And so there's a lot of things that you can do and that they can carry also. And some of them indeed have temporary housing options because they know that they're hiring internationally and they're going to always face a housing problem. So they're just structurally renting a few flats around town, and they get the people in there for 6 months, and then after 6 months they move out and so forth. So some of them do that. At the same time, as you know, in Europe we have a lot of smaller companies, a lot of SMEs. Our economic tissue is mostly those, and a lot of those don't necessarily have that experience with international hiring tout court. Some of them have hired maybe from a neighboring country within the EU, but to go and tell them, what about hiring displaced talents? That's a completely different story. And so that's very different from, for instance, the bigger companies. So I wouldn't want to generalize and say that, some have more willingness than others. I think a lot of them are open, especially the ones that we're working with, into exploring this, but not all of them have the means and the knowledge to provide solutions. So some of them would just say, I don't have a solution for the housing question. You're coming to me, but I don't see how I can do this, right? Yeah. I would also need to seek support maybe from an external partner on this, while others would have a solution in-house, right? So there is a big, the big diversity out there also in terms of employers, I think. What we can think of in terms of future-oriented questions is, shouldn't we bring solutions not at the level of the individual employer, but more from the level of, for instance, a sector, right? What about chambers of commerce? What about sector federations? What about possibly authorities? In Belgium now, there is this initiative. They've created what they call international houses. And they've done that because they saw that all of these newcomers, they're kind of getting lost in the whole complexity of Belgium, right? And so by province, they create international houses, which are really the place to go to for newcomers, whether they are displaced talents, economic migrants, and so forth. And there you get a lot of advice on very practical things, what in this region, in this province, what's the best path towards housing, right? How would that work? What do I need to do? Do I need to go in an interview? Do I need to file a document? What's the practices in this country, right? And then, but all the other things that come with it, like how do I open a bank account? I mean, all of these very practical things. So those are initiatives that the government is taking, very positive, of course, because it's for all international talents. It's not for one company. So there's this connecting of the dots also to be made between what individual companies do and sometimes offer, how that then relates to others that are not able to do that, and how the government plays a role into bringing all these things together, sometimes just by centralizing it and having like a one-stop shop, where you very often a lot of information is already existing. You just need to make it available and accessible by having this one-stop shop and then facilitating the whole process, both for the employers, but also, of course, for the newcomers, for the displaced talents.
Quite simply, the ask now is that employers do it. That's the option that we've got. So employers pay for temporary housing, they pay for the visas, they pay for the flights, employers pay for everything, but that is the barrier to scale. You will reach a limit with employers who are able to do it, the funding, and it's no longer competitive to other international hires if that is the constant ask. And that's why our ambition and our hope is that we can be more systematic with it and more creative and innovative. So the integration workshop, the sustainable finance workshop, hopefully tomorrow, will solve it. I think there's a few brains in this room. I'm going to go over time for 1 second because I think there's some questions at the back. So if we could go to one final question at the back.
Maybe we can go through some other online questions that we have.
Yeah, we'll see.
Just before coming back.
Thank you. Giovanni Di Gio is asking what steps can be taken to harmonize immigration labor laws to facilitate talents integration. Someone else is asking about the measures in place to ensure the sustainability of labor pathways for refugees in terms of funding and long-term integration to local labor markets.
I think to the first point around harmonization, I absolutely agree. I think that's an integral part of success and how we scale. So to that point, I think an EU directive is like the best mechanism, the tool by which we achieve that, and that would harmonize across the board. It means that each country would be applying the rules in the same manner. And for employers, if they are really looking to scale to hire displaced talent into different countries, it facilitates their own internal processes. It means that they are able to work hand in glove with that immigration process. So I think that is, from a harmonisation perspective, it's the EU directive that would be the best tool to achieve that.
From a labour market integration perspective, I think the biggest thing is raising awareness. This is a small project. It's not, at the moment, it's a small project. It's a small movement. So growing inertia, raising awareness for this to actually be a workforce planning solution, I think is the first step. And I think the second step is around incentives. It's also around training and really narrative change. Some of the questions that we get from employers are like astonishing. We had an interview with the NHS of nurses. So a hospital group, a chief of nursing was interviewing candidates. And then we sort of said, oh, how was the interview? Are you taking anyone forward? She was like, oh, we didn't even ask any technical questions. We were just like asking them about their personal stories because we were so surprised they were educated. And it came from a really good place, but it just showed that even they were willing to hire, but didn't assume that people had an education because there was this label of a refugee. So I think the integration starts with raising awareness, with narrative change. And inherently, we're seeing more and more of that. I think international recruitment is not huge in Europe. That's also a really surprising thing because you're like, look, we've got this talent. And they were like, where are they in Brussels? And we're like, well, they're actually in Beirut. And so, the conversation escalates there. So I think it's a lot more around once you overcome those things to actually introduce the talent. When you get to that point, the conversion is really high because the talent is exceptional, as we can see with Khaled. So yeah, I think that's it. I just want to give that final, I know that you've had your hand up the entire time. So do you want to ask your question?
Hello. I don't have a question, just a small contribution to transfer my suffering and thousands of people like me, if you have time for that. I'm Muhammad Salim from Syria, a newcomer. I came and I'm full of motivation and innovation, but unfortunately, day by day, I'm losing this, both of them, because I don't have a place to stay. I think about where I will sleep today. I don't have anything today. And I started learning language, Dutch language, and I don't have a place to study. So thousands like me come and we have full of energy and power to contribute in this committee and add value for this committee. But unfortunately, we need official paper, and we don't have. I need to get technical training to be ready to start working. But also, I need official work paper, and I don't have this. There are many jobs, like public jobs, doesn't need professionals experience, like cleaning street, painting. You can, as organizations, partner for you, you can just do 2 weeks or 4 weeks training, and they will be ready to contribute in this community. This one solution. And that will turn us from producer to be consumers, just consumer, and that will increase your economy problem, that's country or another countries. Just I want to spotlight these points and put everything in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I thank you for that really powerful message. I think I think you've really wrapped up some of the core challenges and really humanized it. And I think that the message that we can take away is there's a lot more to do. I think you're in the right place to have some conversations about how that applies. But hopefully that's a message to say we have had great success. We've moved hundreds of people, but there is now opportunity and potential to move hundreds and literally thousands more. So as we move into lunch, I want to set a really optimistic tone. I want to echo Katrien's optimism and positivity around the way forward and creating more impact, creating more systemic change, creating more sustainability and scalability. So I think DT4E was the first step into what this is going to mean for Europe. And, you know, with the encouragement that we've received from the European Commission and all of you in attendance and online, I think we're in really good lockstep to advance. So to Rob, Gemma, Chris, Katrien and Khaled, thank you so much for your insights, your dedication and all your work. If we can have a round of applause. And to all of you, thank you for your engagement. The first session was a really long one, but it's time for lunch. I think stay here. We're going to pass on to our great host. So thank you very much.
So thank you ever so much, Marina. Not one to hold you back from your lunch, but just a few reactions and reflections on that last session. I think what we heard, and Marina said it perfectly, setting the note for this positive next steps forward is a really important way in which the DT4E program has created this ecosystem. That, using Rob's word, my colleague, there's been the creation of a mainstreaming process, bringing together a series of different stakeholders on the road to complementary labour pathways. What we heard in this opening panel is not only a really personalised journey from Khaled, and thank you so much for that, but also a reflection on the many challenges, but also very encouraging and aspirational elements that have come out from the co-design from the different partners, from testing models as we move forward, but also a reflection on what's needed next. And I think what really comes out of it is integration, 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 both from the perspective of the family members, critical to look in the next phase, but also in terms of what this means for the displaced talent themselves.